Comparison is Killing Me Slowly by Natasha Romanov Official, A Shade of Green. Chapter 5. Some random tin can man with a heart condition. Karen has just connected to the server. The Avengers, Pepper and Harley all jump to their feet in unison. Great, now where's Peter? Tony asked, pulling an electronic map out of nowhere. Karen has her tracker deactivated, and I cannot give a location unless she sends out a distress call. If a distress call is sent out, you will have direct access to every deactivated protocol, such as locations, vitals, and injury scan. Tony sat back down, his face in his hands. Friday, have you made contact with Fury yet? Immediately after finding out that Peter had gone on a mission involving Hydra, the group had unanimously decided it must have been Fury who had convinced him to go. Who else had direct access to him, and who else did they have evidence of recently being in contact with Peter? They had Friday trying to reach Fury for hours now, and even after the sun had set over the sparkling city and the stars began to blink to life, they still had no answer. Peter was on the other side of the country, and they had no way to get to him. No, he is still unavailable. Well, keep trying, Rhodey said. He looked over to his best friend, and he knew that Tony would not be able to handle it if he lost his kid forever, especially since he had already lost his kid on accident. Tony had so much to work through with Peter, and he already despised himself for letting it go this far. It was like his kid was already gone. Minutes passed in silence. Finally, Friday shattered it. Karen is sending out a distress call. Level 5 urgency. Tony jumped to his feet, eyes wide. Location? A map appeared and a red blinking dot flashed miles and miles away from the closest California city. What's going on, Friday? What's Peter's situation? Bucky stood and walked closer to look at the map. Another screen appeared, displaying vitals. Low vitals and thready pulse. Peter has sustained serious injuries and is currently unconscious. What injuries? Fry, what injuries? Tony began pulling up different contact information. Who was in charge of the mission, and who could he contact to send his kid home? The AI couldn't answer fast enough. He has second and third degree burns to his legs, a severe concussion and deep lacerations to his chest. He is suffering from major blood loss. The cause seems to be some kind of homemade bomb. What? Tony whispered, his expression dropping. He froze, going completely still, save his hands that began to shake against his will. You are receiving a call from Nick Fury, Friday chimed. Pepper threw her hands in the air. Answer! Fury's urgent voice echoed through the silent room. Stark, Peter's headed home. Have Cho and Bruce ready. He needs surgery. Oh, really? I couldn't tell from major blood loss. Tony finally broke, a hand over his mouth and tears falling from his eyes. He'll be there in less than 10 minutes. 5 if we're lucky. Please be ready. How? He's all the way in California, Sam yelled. We enlisted the help of Dr. Strange after things went sideways. He'll be overseeing the surgery, Fury answered. Oh, and Tony? Yes, Tony's shaking voice answered. We may need your input on treatment. The call went dead. Orange sparks flew in circles and a portal opened into the operating theatre. Tony, Cho and Bruce looked up as Dr. Strange stepped through, carrying a dripping, limp body. God, the kid looked so small. The stench of burning skin and thick blood filled the air, and Tony barely resisted the urge to vomit. Just barely. Strange set Peter on the table and pulled the slick suit away from the boy's torso, examining it closely. The suit would go no farther, being slightly burned into the skin. Tony, we need your consent for treatment, Strange said, pulling away. Tony didn't like the uncharacteristically worried expression Strange wore. What consent? If it'll help them, then yes, the answer is yes. Tony, Our safest option is also our worst. Just tell me what it is. The father had been fighting off a panic attack ever since the distress signal had come out. He was about to explode. The shrapnel. There's shrapnel in him! Tony yelled immediately. He looked down at his son and saw many, many deep cuts littering his abdomen. The sight was all too familiar to him. We need your arc reactor technology, Strange said softly. Tony looked up, wide, scared brown eyes meeting the worried cold blue ones. Tony's eyebrows furrowed as if to ask, "It's that bad?" Strange gave a short nod. And that was all Tony needed. He was off to the races, speeding through the halls and to his workshop. And suddenly, Tony understood why Pepper had hated the arc reactor so much. One chunk of fallible metal. One small piece of metal standing in between Peter and death. The surgery had been a success. Somehow. While unable to get all the shrapnel out of Peter, they had set up the reactor to keep him safe while they waited for a less urgent time to complete the surgery. Just like you, Tony. We'll give it some time and then we'll get all the shrapnel out, Bruce had said. I hope that wasn't supposed to be reassuring, Tony had countered. Bruce hung his head quietly, and Tony continued. How the hell can I be calm when there's shrapnel just sitting there in my kid? Strange and Cho had also worked together to get the rest of the suit away from all the burns in his legs, and he was being treated for his concussion. Now Peter lay silently in a hospital bed, with a breathing mask over his mouth and bandages all over him. Tony had carefully covered him with the thin sheet and kissed his forehead gently, barely brushing the skin. All his fault. Tony shook his head, knowing he deserved to think those thoughts, but not wanting to all the same. He needed his head clear right now. He couldn't be distracted, not while the arc reactor was the only thing keeping his kid from dying a slow, painful death, and the tech that kept that from happening hadn't been used in a year. Tony sat back in the chair next to the hospital bed and watched the still blue light that emitted silently from his son's chest. Now Tony understood why Peter had been so comforted by the still blue light. It meant life. As long as the light was on, his son was alive. His son had a chance. What do you mean he's not the same? What are his injuries? Shrapnel? What do you mean you can't get it out? Well, is he going to live? Pepper shook herself from her flashback. Her son could not end up like her husband. Even if her husband had turned out okay, it had taken time and lots of mistakes and pain. She sat on the floor of Tony's lab, staring at the empty case that Tony had usually kept his arc reactor in. She knew why it was gone, but she didn't want to believe it. Another person she loved, reliant on this stupid hunk of metal. I hate technology so much, Pepper whispered into the silence. But she couldn't really say that when it was the only thing keeping her Peter alive, when it had saved her husband. Also, she was the CEO of a tech company. Pepper stood up shakily and wiped her eyes carefully. Fry, how's Peter doing? Peter is stable. His vitals and pulses are normal. Pepper laughed, relief flooding her senses with hope. Peter was alive. Her son had a chance. Harley wasn't sure how he had ended up in Peter Parker's hospital room. He was vaguely aware that he had asked Friday if he could see him, but he hadn't been exactly sure why. It clicked as Harley watched the pale boy breathe slowly, the arc reactor moving up and down in sync with his breath. Even though Harley had barely seen the kid in the month that he had been staying here, he had grown very fond of him. He had actually annoyed Friday at one point after he asked where Peter was too many times in 2 hours. He had really just wanted to get to know him, especially since he was moving into the tower. Tony had spoken so highly of him, so affectionately, there was no way Harley wasn't going to try and win him over. Peter also seemed particularly intelligent. Harley had no doubt that the younger team was smarter than him, though he would never admit that. Okay, maybe he would. The few times he had spoken to Peter, he had felt like they could be the best of friends. They could have the best of times, and cause the worst of times. Apparently, they were both notorious for practical jokes. Harley sat carefully at the empty chair at Peter's bedside. Tony had been sitting there before Strange had pulled him away to talk to Fury. So, Harley sat alone, in the silence. Okay, this is unbearable. Harley finally broke the silence. Look, I know you probably can't hear me, but I wish you would wake up so that you could hear what I have to say. Peter felt like he was floating. His legs were completely numb, his arms felt like they were laying in cotton. His head was pounding. His eyes suddenly sensed dim light through his eyelids, and his ears picked up a dull thrumming, a low beeping, and an unsteady heartbeat. And his own heartbeat. He listened carefully as the low thrumming became clearer, beginning to turn into words. And, I know you probably were just uncomfortable being around me. I understand that. I just wish I could have gotten to know you more. I'm so sorry this happened to you. This really is all my fault, no matter what Natasha says. Peter squinted, looking through his eyelids to see who was talking. He could usually tell from the heartbeat, but his brain felt scrambled, fried, and cloudy. He would have to rely on sight. Harley stood by his bed, ranting quietly. It took a minute to get his voice to work, but finally Peter was able to speak. I thought I was the only one here who could rant for minutes at a time. Harley jumped and turned to face him, his eyes going wide. He paused, processing Peter's words, and a shy smile crossed his face. Tony says we have that in common, he whispered. Then he spun towards the door. I have to get Tony. Please don't, Peter whispered, squeezing his eyes shut. Harley turned back to him, confused. But he nodded, hesitated, and asked, Do you want me to stay? Sure. Peter smiled as best he could. It was slightly lopsided, he knew, but he wasn't in a place for anyone to be judging him. I wanted to get to know you more, too. Harley rubbed the back of his neck and sat down in the chair. Now may not be a very good time for those 53 questions, huh? Peter laughed quietly, but stopped quickly when he realised how badly it hurt to laugh. Maybe not, he whispered before adding. What the hell? Were my vocal cords fried? Harley's eyebrows furrowed, and he leaned over to pick up the clipboard at the foot of the bed. He flipped through a couple of pages and said, Well, I don't see anything. Oh, wait. Fry, Peter's vocal cords okay? Yes. Peter shook his head, his tilted smile on his face again. Well, it hurts like hell to talk. Then don't, Harley reasoned. Peter laid his head back and whispered, It's logic like that keeps the world spinning. Harley chuckled but couldn't find a witty response. He decided to change the subject. How badly does it hurt? Peter winced as he turned to look at Harley again. I dunno. Bad? Yeah. Bruce put you on some pretty hard painkillers, but he said he might have to up your dose. I can tell him if you want. Yeah, that would be good. Harley nodded solemnly. Okay, Fry, will you tell Bruce to up the dose? The AI responded affirmatively, and the teens turned back to each other. Is your chest sore? Tony said it hurt when he first got his reactor put in. Harley asked, his eyebrows furrowed in genuine concern. Peter stared at the boy. What did Afghanistan have to do with anything? Peter squinted at Harley and then turned to look instinctively at his torso. A familiar blue light emitted from a small circle in his chest. There was an arc reactor in him. Peter's tired brain moved slowly, not processing it completely. What's that doing there? He asked. Harley seemed to realise that Peter hadn't been told about the arc yet, and began to try and distract him. What else could he do? He had no idea how bad it would be for Peter's health if he panicked. Hey, Peter, I have a question for you. Peter squinted at him, the reactor fleeing willingly from his mind. Shoot. I saw that broken robot on your desk. Friday said you were wanting to fix it up, and I don't know, I was wondering if you'd want to do it together. Peter was surprised. Delighted, but surprised. That would be so cool, but summer's almost over. Don't you have to go home at the end? Harley winced slightly. Actually, Peter, I think I might be moving in here. Peter's immediate thought was that the world was ending, and then he remembered his situation and he thought, well, maybe everyone had learned a lesson, and he had no reason not to want to be around Harley anymore. The team seemed to think he was all right. Harley felt that Peter was taking too long to respond, not realising that the younger teen's brain was working half as quickly as it usually did. But I'm not for sure if I will yet. You know, I'm not completely sure why Tony asked me to, and... Tony sees you as his kid, you know, Peter interrupted. Harley looked slightly taken aback, before a pleased smile graced his lips. Well, that makes two of us. He grinned and looked up to Peter, a mischievous gleam in his eyes. You know, I always wanted a brother. Peter's eyebrows raised in shock, before the corners of his mouth twitched upward too. So did I, he said. Right, I understand you're upset. I put your son in danger, Fury said calmly. Oh, I'm not just upset. Why the hell would you send him on such a high-risk case? He's a baby, Tony yelled back. Fury sighed. Peter is much more capable and mature than any of you are willing to admit, but I digress. I didn't want him on the mission either. Maybe they should have picked someone older. Maybe! But they were unwilling. Spider-Man was their best option, and Peter has proved himself capable. Tony put his face in his hands, taking a calming breath. He then pulled away to face the agent again. That's it, I can't even look at you right now. I'm going to see my kid. Not so fast, Buzz Lightyear, Fury said. Peter has been prescribed rest and alone time. He needs a minute to sort some stuff out. What could he have to sort out when he's still unconscious from a concussion that he received from an explosion in a Hydra base? Tony began yelling again, his calming breath going to complete waste. I assume you remember the circumstances that you found out he went on a mission, you know, after he had already been gone for 3 days. Fury answered, returning the aggression. Tony shook his head and laughed an angry laugh. You took my kid away on a mission, a dangerous mission, and then you come here and instead of telling us that he was in danger, you just pretended you had no idea where he was, pretended you were just as confused as all of us. My son is dying because of you. Why didn't you pull him from the mission? I talked to Peter about how hurt he felt. That's more than you can say, Tony, Fury said. And I was honouring Peter's wishes. He wouldn't have wanted me to tell you that he was feeling neglected and alone. He just said he wanted you to realise by yourself. I'm just sorry I had to help to push that along. Tony took a deep breath, knowing that Fury was right. And it hurt to be so wrong, so rightfully guilty. Fury strided into Peter's hospital room and jerked his finger towards the door when Harley saw him. The teen waved at Peter and left without resistance. Fury knelt by the bed. How are you feeling? Sore. A little happier. I'm glad I went on the mission, Peter whispered. Harley's cool. Fury gave him a small smile. Only Peter would find a bright side to almost dying. How are you feeling when it comes to everyone else, though? Peter shrugged and hesitantly met Fury's eyes. I miss my dad. I want Tony here, but I don't know, I'm still hurt. Fury nodded in understanding. I get it, kid. You know, you can have him here and still wait to forgive him. Peter looked at him hopefully. Yeah? Yeah, I think it would help Tony too. If you forgave him too easily, he might be worried about how nice you are to everyone else. Fury chuckled. Peter rolled his eyes slowly. It hurt to do that, too. Great. Fury stood up. Well, your dad wants to kick me out, so I'm gonna go before he can do that. Peter gave a small smile. It's because you sent me on a mission in Hollywood by myself, isn't it? How did you know? Fury asked with a smirk. He paused and added, Just make sure you forgive them at your own pace. You know my pace is too fast for my own good. I have super speed. True. Well, I don't know what to tell you, kid. They've ignored you for half of your summer break, decided not to portion their time out evenly between you two kids, and didn't notice when you went missing. That's extremely irresponsible parenting, or whatever it is that they do for you. It's up to you whether you think it's worth it to have gone through all of that, only for them to get an immediate apology and then learn no lesson. A sudden silence breezed through the room as Fury waited for Peter's response. You're right, Peter said quietly. Maybe I'll ditch my super speed for this one. Fury smiled. Am I still allowed to visit? Of course, it'll just add insult to injury that the guy they won't ever let me hang out with is the only guy I want to see right now. Peter grinned mischievously. Fury shook his head. And this is exactly why they don't let me see you. The man left the room, and Peter drifted back into sleep almost immediately. Peter woke with a start, sitting up in his bed and crying out immediately at the searing pain in his head. He clutched his head, squeezing his eyes shut. It was a desperate battle against tears and the darkness threatening to claim him again. Sitting up always put him on the verge of passing out, especially when it was sudden. The pain in his head quickly became overwhelming. It took minutes before it began subsiding, and by the time it did, Peter realised that he was laying back down, with a hand pressing an ice pack against his head, and another hand running through his hair and brushing it from his face. Silent tears were running down his face, and he took a deep breath as he heard a familiar voice speaking quiet Italian to him. Peter usually understood what Tony was saying when he spoke Italian, but he was behind on quite a few miles of brain power. He listened to the comforting voice as his breathing began to slow and even out. Peter's eyes finally squinted open, and through the dark his father looked down at him with barely concealed worry on his face, lit by the blue light from the arc reactor. Hey, Bambino, the man whispered, aware of how irritative Peter's super hearing had to be. Peter, completely out of it, raised his eyebrows in greeting and closed his eyes again, focusing on his breathing. When it was finally completely steady, he opened his eyes again. Tony was still there. And this simple gesture made Peter's face tilt into a lopsided smile. Tony raised a single eyebrow. What? You're still here, Peter mumbled. Tony frowned. Of course I am, Bambino, especially after... He shook his head. We'll talk later. We'll have a long talk about that later. How are you feeling right now? Happy, Peter said, drawing out the word. You're here. Well, aren't you easily pleased? Tony said. Peter didn't notice the sad undertones to the teasing voice. A little floaty, Peter mumbled. Yeah, Bruce gave you the good stuff, Tony murmured. Peter didn't know about the whole fiasco that had happened to make them realise that he needed the good stuff. Like how Peter had been just laying in bed crying, completely emotionless and staring at the ceiling, still. They had all freaked out, asking what was wrong when Bruce waltzed in, took one look at Peter and said, Whoa, Harley wasn't kidding. He does need stronger meds. Tony continued to run his fingers through his kid's hair, happy that it always relaxed Peter so easily. Happy that at least that hadn't changed. Why do I have an arc reactor? Peter drew out the last word carefully, trying not to mispronounce it in his delirious state. We had to, baby. I'm so sorry. I'll explain it all later, okay? He pressed a kiss to Peter's forehead and continued. I'm so sorry this is happening. I'm so sorry you have to have one of those. Peter shrugged and rolled carefully onto his side to face Tony. It's okay. It's like a noise fan and nightlight all in one. Tony smiled despite himself and pressed another kiss to the kid's head. I love you, Petey. You know that? I love you so, so much, baby. More than you'll ever know. Peter squinted at him and put a hand on Tony's that was holding an ice pack. Thanks, he said, and then said, I love you too, Dad, but I'm still sad. Tony shook his head quickly. And you have every right to be, kid. What happened? What I did? It was unacceptable. I know, Peter whispered. He was trying desperately to stay awake, but the overwhelming comfort of not being alone was overpowering, and he quickly dozed back off. I failed? Peter asked. 2 weeks after the incident, as everyone was calling it, Tony had begged them to stop, but it was already sticking. Kind of like Peter's hand at the moment. The kid was freaking out. Peter was out of the med bay and was able to roll around in a wheelchair. His legs were still quite damaged, and it would take some more time before he was able to begin walking again. Tony patted Peter's hand that was sticking to his forearm, the closest thing Peter had been able to reach from his lower position. Peter, it's okay, Tony whispered. No, I failed? He asked again, looking up at his father, a bewildered look on his face. Harley chuckled despite himself, but stopped when Tony shot him a look. Harley put a hand on Peter's shoulder and explained himself. That doesn't happen often, huh? Peter slowly shook his head. But that's not even why I'm surprised. I got the book. I got the drive. How did I fail? It was a decoy, Fury explained carefully. There wasn't anything of substance in the Winter Soldier book, and we have reason to believe it was fake. There was nothing on the drive you found. Fury knelt in front of Peter. But, kid, you already surpassed our expectations. Don't beat yourself up over this. Yeah, Peter, Harley said, patting his friend's shoulder. It's not always about drive. Despite himself, Peter cackled. He was still on his pain meds and was slightly loopy. Tony was angry that his kid had been sent on such a high-risk mission that ended up nearly killing him, only for it to be pointless. But at this point, he could only be grateful that Peter was still alive. Even though Peter was slightly more closed off than before, Tony had expected it and deserved it. He would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of Peter's trust. Harley pushed the wheelchair gently against Fury, nudging the older agent. All right, old man, we were trying to go somewhere before you cut us off. Fury rolled his eyes and stood up. I am not an old man. Well, that's not what Peter said while he was on his truth juice. Fury squinted at the two boys, who began giggling quietly. Right. Fury continued down the hall, out of their way and out of sight. Tony could only be grateful that after everything, Harley and Peter had grown closer. Peter, wait! Tony yelled. Friday, close the window! Peter stopped short in front of the suddenly closed window. What the heck? Tony? Peter, maybe it's a little too soon to be out on patrol again. Tony gently cut him off, gripping his shoulders. Peter pulled his mask off and tilted his head slightly. But my head's okay and I can walk again. I know, but Peter... Tony looked down at the arc reactor pointedly, then back at his kid. That's not something... Look, people are going to find out at some point, Peter interrupted. No, that's not what I'm worried about, Tony said, his forehead creasing in concern and sympathy. It's sensitive technology, Pete. One well-aimed hit, or bullet. If it breaks, Peter, we may not be fast enough, and I don't think anyone could take losing you again. Peter hung his head. A moment of silence passed before Peter whispered, "They need me." "I know they do, Peter," Tony said, pulling Peter into a hug and resting his cheek against the top of the younger boy's head. "But if you die, they'll be missing you for a lot longer." Peter hated that his dad was right, but every day it became easier to listen to him, easier to forgive him. Tony hadn't been lying when he said he was going to do everything to fix his mistake. Peter returned the hug. "Peter?" The dining room went quiet at the sight of Peter, standing next to Harley. "Yeah?" he asked, eyebrows raised. Harley chuckled and pushed him towards the kitchen. "It's your first time eating with everyone since the incident," he whispered to the younger boy. "Ah." Peter glanced at the older teen with a wicked grin as they entered the kitchen to get their plates. "What if I just got a plate, moved towards my chair, and then just left and went back to my room?" Harley's jaw dropped, his eyes glinting mischievously. "Peter Parker Stark, you're evil. I support it." The two boys giggled. "Tony made a hell of a mistake introducing us," Harley whispered. "You betcha. We're going to ruin their lives." Peter laughed quietly as they scooped food onto their plates, and then turned to Harley, eyes alight with excitement. "Oh, I can't wait for April Fool's next year." Harley grinned. "Oh, it's going to be hell on earth." The Avengers listened to the quiet sounds of the boys whispering to each other in the kitchen, wondering what they were discussing. Maybe Harley was trying to convince Peter to stay? A sudden round of cackling echoed from the kitchen, and they all realised they were doomed. Time passed, and soon school was beginning again. Peter and Harley returned together. Though they weren't in the same class, they had convinced Pepper to enrol Harley into the same STEM school as Peter. Now Happy had to drive two energetic boys to school every morning. "It's a nightmare," Happy would tell everyone, but would never mention that it was the most tame nightmare he could imagine. The boys always made him smile, more than he'd let them know. As the time escaped them, Peter found himself avoiding the Avengers less and less. Though it had taken him less time to forgive the ones he hadn't been as close to, excluding Tony, who wouldn't leave Peter alone, he was making significant progress with Nat, Rhodey and Bucky. They had promised him that they didn't care how long it took him to forgive them, though they hoped it would be soon, but would wait happily until he gave it. Of course, they would also be working to gain it. And with time, Peter found himself more and more happy and comfortable with his life at the tower. It was just like before, but with the happy addition of an older brother. He had always wanted siblings. In the few months Peter and Harley had known each other, they had become inseparable. Though they fought sometimes, they always made up, but that's just how strong relationships work. They had begun and finished many great projects together, practically ruined Halloween with all the pranks they pulled, and reinstated movie and game night. They'd even fixed up that robot Peter had found at the beginning of the summer. They truly were brothers in everything that counted. And, as Christmas rolled around, they learned of another soon-to-come addition to the family. "Merry Christmas, everyone!" Peter yelled. Harley entered the room directly behind him, hands on Peter's shoulders as Peter dragged him around on his socks. "Yes, Merry Christmas. I see St. Nick decided to join us," Harley said as Peter slid Harley past Fury. Fury glared at the teens. The Avengers laughed at the ridiculous antics of the brothers. Almost 6 months had passed since the incident, and things couldn't be better. Or at least that's what they thought. Soon, presents were being ripped open and people were yelling at each other, thanks and insults due to the many genuine or gag gifts. And Peter and Harley were seeing how many peppermints they could slip in Clint's hot cocoa before he noticed. Suddenly, it went silent. The shift in mood caused Harley and Peter to turn to each other, bewildered looks on their faces. Looking around the room, they saw the cause. Tony and Pepper stood grinning at Rhodey, whose jaw had dropped, along with a few tears. Wait, actually?" he asked, Pepper and Tony nodded, equally goofy grins on their faces. Rhodey turned to the group to look at Harley and Peter. "Did you kids know?" "Know what?" Peter asked. Harley rolled his eyes. "They don't tell us anything anymore, not after Peter hacked." "Hey, what happened to about forgiving and forgetting?" Okay, whatever, but now I'm curious," Harley said, and the two teens turned to face their uncle and parents. After Pepper and Tony officially gained custody of Harley, big fiasco they decided not to talk about, Harley and Peter had started calling them Mom and Dad. As a prank at first, but it had ended up making the two cry, and so they had decided they were too far to go back. Also, it had felt right. Rhodey had them adopted as his nephews, though he found that he could not sign any paperwork to make it legally binding. "What did you have to say to make Uncle Rhodey cry?" "You didn't bring up the War Patriot branding change, did you?" Peter asked, faking exasperation. "Oh, never mind, I don't know if I can handle another one," Pepper said, interrupting the boys' prolonged banter. "We could probably have Strange reverse it," Tony shrugged. "Wait, another Peter?" Harley asked, standing up in fake outrage. "Yeah, I couldn't handle it either." Rhodey's eyes widened, and he gave a nervous smile. "Yeah, about that." Peter and Harley's jaws dropped in unison. "Wait, what?" Their parents smiled at them and rolled their eyes. "Rhodey, why don't you do the honours? I've never been great with words," Tony said. Rhodey turned to the Avengers and yelled, "I'm going to be an uncle for the third time." Everyone erupted into cheers and congratulations. The two teens walked together to their parents, eyebrows raised as if to ask, "Is this a prank?" Tony shook his head and pulled his two boys into a tight hug. "It's a girl," he whispered to the boys. They pulled away, eyes wide in excitement. "Don't tell anyone else," Tony added quickly. "I asked Friday and I wasn't supposed to." The two boys motioned, zipping their lips, locking them with multiple padlocks and throwing away the keys. Tony laughed at his kids. They would be okay. After all, the Stark family was made of iron. Thank you for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this fic. Have a lovely rest of your day.